I was 28 when I stayed in that cabin, and I've never looked at the desert the same way again. It was late October 2017. I'd been going through a rough patch back in Sacramento, burned out from work, going through a breakup, and just sick of being around people. My older cousin Greg told me about this little place he once used for photography shoots, tucked far out in northern Arizona, south of the Navajo Nation but not too far from it either. Said it was a perfect getaway. No tourists, no cell signal, no distractions. A dusty little one-room cabin up on some dry hills, surrounded by open plains, scattered juniper trees, and nothing else. I needed it. I told work I'd be off-grid for a few days, packed up my truck, and left early one morning. Took me nearly 15 hours to get there. The last few hours were on dirt roads, badly rutted, winding through low ridges and past scraggly red rock. I followed Greg's instructions exactly.
No GPS.
Just handwritten directions because he said I'd lose signal about an hour before I got close. He wasn't wrong. Once I passed through the last tiny gas stop, signal vanished. I drove another 30 miles past that, cutting through dry country where I didn't see a single person. Just some cattle here and there and a few rusted fences that looked like they hadn't been maintained in years. I arrived just before dusk. The cabin was small. One door, two little windows, tin roof, old pine walls weathered and grayed out from years of sun. There was no power, just a little fireplace inside and a cot against the back wall. Greg said it used to be a hunter's cabin, built back in the 60s or maybe even earlier. Nobody used it much anymore. There was a small outhouse about 20 yards out back and a shed next to it with some firewood and a couple rusty tools. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and stepped inside. It was cooler than I expected in the evenings, probably mid-40s. The air smelled like dust and pine and old ash. Inside, it was quiet, dead quiet. I stood there for a bit, letting the stillness sink in. It was almost too quiet, like the world had muted itself. The first night was uneventful. I lit a small fire, boiled some water with a camp stove I brought, and ate a hot meal. Then I just sat outside, leaning against a rock, watching the stars come out. The sky looked massive out there.
No lights anywhere.
Just thousands of stars stretching forever, and the faint orange curve of the moon rising low over the hills. Eventually, I went inside and lay down on the cot. It was hard but clean. I read for a bit by lantern light, then dozed off. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, I woke up. It was subtle. I didn't sit bolt upright or anything dramatic like that. I just opened my eyes, alert for no real reason. The fire had died down. The lantern was off. It was very dark. I stared at the low ceiling and listened. Nothing at first. Then I heard it. Something outside. Not loud, just soft crunching, like a footstep on dry dirt. Then nothing. A few seconds later, another crunch. Closer. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, I figured. Maybe a coyote. Maybe a deer. They roam these parts, and it wasn't unusual. I've camped before. I know what animals sound like. But something about the spacing of those steps made me feel off. The timing, the slow, deliberate rhythm of it. Not the random scurry of an animal. Not the erratic trot of a four-legged thing. This was different, almost like someone walking. I sat up slowly and looked toward the window. Couldn't see anything through the old, wavy glass. I reached for the flashlight and carefully moved to the door, but I didn't open it. I just stood there listening. Nothing. I stayed there for almost 10 minutes, then climbed back into bed. But I didn't sleep well after that. The next day, I hiked out in the morning just exploring. There was a small ridge to the east, and I climbed it. From the top, I could see out for miles. Low hills, little gullies, some scrub brush and scattered trees. No houses, no other people, not even a road, just endless dry land. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind and feeling the sun on my face. When I came back in the afternoon, something was off. I noticed it as soon as I reached the cabin. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had latched it shut. There was no lock, just a basic metal latch you slid into a notch. Couldn't have blown open. It wasn't that windy, and the door had weight to it. Still, I told myself maybe I hadn't closed it right. Maybe I rushed out too fast. Inside, nothing looked touched, but I checked my things anyway. My pack was still there. My water, my food supplies, the lantern, nothing gone. Nothing moved. I tried to shake it off, made some coffee and sat on the steps watching the horizon again. The sky was clouding up slightly, some thin gray streaks moving in. The light started to fade early. By nightfall, I was uneasy. I kept hearing little sounds in the brush outside. Could have been wind, could have been animals, but I didn't like it. Something about the way the sounds came and went. Too regular, too paced. Just after midnight, I thought I saw someone. It was quick. I had stepped outside to take a piss. The moon was out, silver and sharp, casting long shadows. As I stood near the edge of the clearing, I thought I saw movement about 40 feet away. A shape. It moved between two trees, low and fast. Not running, not walking, just slipping past. I froze, waited, stared, but I didn't see it again. I backed inside, latched the door, and sat by the window in the dark with my flashlight off, just watching. I waited for an hour, maybe more. My eyes hurt from squinting, but I didn't see anything else. The third day, I went to check the shed out back. I hadn't looked closely before. It was just a lean-to style structure with 3 walls, some stacked firewood, and a few tools. But this time, something caught my eye. In the dirt beside the shed were prints. Not clear footprints, just impressions. But they were big, barefoot, human-looking, but the toes were long, almost too long. I bent down and looked closer. The ground was too dry for a perfect print, but the shape was wrong for anything else.
No clothes.
No pads like a coyote. It looked like a barefoot person had been there. I stared at it for a while, not sure what to think. The idea of a person wandering out here barefoot felt insane. The rocks alone would shred your feet, let alone the thorns and cactus. Back inside the cabin, I stayed mostly in the doorway watching the tree line. Something felt wrong. Not just creepy, but unnatural in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. Every few minutes, I swore I heard something. Movement, breathing, a scrape. Once, something hit the wall on the far side, just a soft knock. I jumped up and rushed outside with the flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just still desert, just wind and cold. I started keeping my knife next to me. Not that I expected to use it, but it gave me something, some sense of control. The fourth night was the worst. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. Clear footsteps outside, pacing, slow, heavy, deliberate, like a man walking in circles around the cabin. I sat up, heart racing. The footsteps moved to the window. I didn't look. I didn't want to. Then a scratch. Something scraping the wood beside the window, like nails. Not fast, not loud. Just a long, slow drag. Then silence. I waited. Then another step. And then something touched the door handle. I heard it. A slow creak as it shifted. I leapt up and shoved a chair under the handle, gripping my knife so tight my hand hurt. Whatever it was didn't try again. But I stood there for an hour, frozen, waiting for another sound. Eventually, I heard movement fading away into the brush. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything into the truck, made sure I had enough gas to get back to town, and started driving. But as I was pulling away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Standing at the tree line, half hidden behind a juniper, was a figure. It wasn't a full silhouette, just part of it. It looked like a person, but too thin, too tall. It didn't move. It didn't wave. It didn't crouch or turn. It just stood there watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving and I didn't look back again. I never reported it. Who would I report it to? The sheriff? The park rangers? Tell them what? That I got scared in the woods? I didn't tell Greg either. I just told him the cabin was too remote for me, and I didn't like being without signal. I think about it a lot, though. The prints, the sounds, the shape in the trees, the skinwalker stories people tell in that part of the country. I used to laugh them off.
Tales.
Legends, superstition. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a ghost. It was something real, something watching, something human enough to move like a person, but wrong enough to make your body go cold. I don't go into the desert alone anymore, and I never went back to that cabin. Not once. It was the spring of 2006. I was 28 years old at the time and had just moved back to Colorado after being away for nearly a decade. Life in Arizona hadn't worked out the way I'd hoped. Dead-end jobs, too much time alone in a city I never really liked. I came back to Colorado to stay with my cousin while I figured out what was next. I didn't have much money, no job lined up, and no real plans. I just wanted a reset. A couple weeks after I got back, I was out driving through the foothills west of Boulder. No real destination, just trying to get out of the house, clear my head. I took a lot of back roads, and at some point, I realized I wasn't far from a place I hadn't thought about in years. A cabin my dad used to take me to when I was a kid. He'd rented it from an old coworker who owned it way up near a forgotten logging road, deep in the trees. It had been a kind of unofficial family getaway for a couple summers in the mid-90s, but then the coworker died in an accident, and no one touched the place again. My dad passed away in '01, and the memory of that cabin kind of went with him. But sitting there in my car, alone and surrounded by the thickening forest, I remembered the crooked sign nailed to the tree, the narrow pull-off just past the mile marker, the path that led down to that moss-covered porch. I don't know what made me want to go see it again. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe I just wanted to feel closer to something from my past, something before everything got messy. I knew the land had probably been sold off or reclaimed by the forest. The cabin might not even be standing anymore, but I wanted to see it. I turned off the paved road and started heading up into the trees. The dirt road was rough, washed out in places, and more overgrown than I remembered. I drove slow, trying to catch landmarks I hadn't seen in over a decade. Eventually, after about 20 minutes of bouncing over rocks and dodging tree limbs, I saw what I thought might be the turnoff. There was no sign anymore, but the shape of the clearing looked right. I pulled over, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute, listening to the creaking of trees in the wind. No other cars. No buildings, just the wind and the forest. I grabbed my jacket from the back seat and stepped out. The air was cool and smelled like wet pine. It felt like being underwater, quiet and muffled. I found the old footpath almost immediately, though it was barely visible beneath the fallen leaves and branches. I followed it, stepping carefully, pushing aside thorns and overgrowth, and after about 5 minutes of walking, I saw the roofline through the trees. The cabin was still there, barely. The porch had sagged so far it looked like it was melting into the ground. The door was hanging crooked on its hinges. One of the windows had shattered, leaving only jagged pieces of glass like broken teeth. The entire front of the cabin was streaked with black rot. Moss covered the steps, but it was still standing. I walked up slowly, testing each step before putting weight on it. When I reached the front door, I nudged it open with my foot, creaked and shifted, resisting at first, then gave way with a sudden jerk. The inside was damp and cold, smelled like mold and mouse droppings, Everything was covered in dust and grime. The furniture was all still there. The old table, the chairs, the broken couch we used to sit on to play cards when it rained. I walked through it slowly, my boots crunching over leaves and rat droppings. The kitchen counter still had the metal can opener my dad used to complain about. I found an old matchbook from some gas station wedged behind a mug. The back room still had the bunk bed I used to sleep in. The mattress was stripped bare, and something had chewed through one of the legs. I wasn't scared, not yet, just unsettled. The way you feel when you realize something you thought was gone forever is still here, but not how you remembered it. It was like walking through a faded version of a childhood dream. I sat on the edge of the old couch for a few minutes, just thinking. I had no signal on my phone. I figured I'd stay for a little bit, maybe eat the sandwich I had in my backpack, then head back before it got dark. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the silence, the feeling of being far away from everything. I should have left. Instead, I stood up and walked out the back door, toward the old tool shed. That shed had always creeped me out when I was a kid. It sat behind the cabin in a narrow patch of trees, half sunk into the earth. The door had always stuck, and there was a weird smell inside, like wet rope and old meat. But my dad used to keep firewood and tools in there, so we had to go in sometimes. I walked around the back and saw that the shed door was wide open. I stopped. I didn't remember it being open when I came up the trail. It might have been, and I just missed it. But I felt something shift in my gut. A small, sharp sense that something wasn't quite right. I walked closer, slowly. Inside the shed, most of the shelves had collapsed. A couple rusted tools still hung from nails on the wall. Something had made a nest in the corner, maybe a raccoon or something larger. There were bones in the nest. Not human, probably squirrel or rabbit. But still, as I stepped further in, my foot hit something hard under a pile of damp cloth. I pulled the cloth back and saw a long metal box, like a footlocker. It had a heavy latch half rusted shut. I opened it. Inside were 2 small gas lanterns, an old camping stove, and a brown paper folder sealed with masking tape. On the outside, someone had written the word logs in black marker. I pulled the folder out, opened it, and found a stack of handwritten pages. Most were soaked through and hard to read, but a few had legible writing. It looked like someone had been tracking visitors to the cabin, dates, weather, hunting results. But after a certain point, the notes changed. The handwriting got shakier. The entries started mentioning things like strangers on the ridge and noises at night. One page said, "He came back last night. I saw him watching from the trees. Stayed until just before sunup." There were no names.
No explanations.
I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I closed the folder and put it back in the box, then stepped outside. That's when I noticed the fresh footprints. They were in the soft dirt near the side of the shed. Heavy boot prints, deeper than mine. And not old, no leaves in them, no debris. The edges were sharp. Someone else had been here, or still was. I turned around and scanned the trees. Nothing, no sound, but I felt it. That prickly feeling on the back of my neck when you know someone's watching. I started walking back to the cabin, trying to stay calm, but I could feel my heart picking up speed. When I got back to the front of the cabin, I saw something that made me stop cold. The door I'd left open was closed, and I hadn't closed it. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. I listened hard, but I couldn't hear anything inside. I don't know why I didn't just run. I should have, but I felt like I needed to know if someone was in there. I stepped up onto the porch again, reached out slowly, and pushed the door open. The cabin was empty, as far as I could tell, but something was different. The sandwich I'd left on the table was gone. My backpack was unzipped. The lantern from the wall hook was lying on the floor. I turned and walked out fast, this time not stopping to look at anything. I made it to the trail and started jogging back toward my car, branches snapping against my arms, breathing sharp and fast. I made it back to the car, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a second, trying to catch my breath. Then I turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't turn over. I tried again. Still nothing. Battery was fine. Lights worked. Just no ignition. I sat there staring at the steering wheel, heart racing. Then I saw movement in the side mirror. Just a flicker. A shape. Someone standing halfway behind a tree about 50 feet behind the car. Too far to see clearly, but definitely a person. They didn't move. They just stood there. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, climbed out, and took off up the road. I ran until my legs gave out, then walked the rest of the way. It took me over 2 hours to get back to the nearest paved road. I flagged down a car and got a ride into town. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to be told I imagined it or that it was just some hunter or squatter. Maybe it was. Maybe that's all it was. But I went back 2 weeks later with a sheriff's deputy and a tow truck. The cabin was gone. Not collapsed. Gone. The trail was overgrown, but I knew exactly where to go. There was nothing there. Just trees and dirt. No foundation, no boards, no trash. Like nothing had ever been there. Even the pull-off where I'd parked my car had been filled with brush and rocks. The tow truck guy thought I was making it up. The deputy just shrugged. They found my car, about half a mile further down, stuck in a ditch, doors open, everything inside gone. I haven't been back since. I don't even drive that direction anymore. I've thought about it a lot over the years. What I saw, what I felt, the folder in the shed, the person behind the tree. It was real. I know it was. But whatever that place was, whatever happened there, it's gone now. And I'm never going looking for it again. It was late October of 2019, and I had taken a few weeks off from work to finally start building a small off-grid cabin on a patch of land I had bought in western North Carolina. I was 33 then, living alone after my divorce, and I'd been needing something to distract myself. Something physical, something quiet. The land sat about a mile off a gravel service road, nestled at the edge of Pisgah National Forest, backed by thick woods and surrounded by nothing but ridgelines and hardwoods. I bought it cheap, probably too cheap, but I didn't care. I wasn't thinking long-term. I just wanted to build something with my hands, sleep somewhere that didn't buzz with traffic noise or flicker with city lights. I'd been bringing supplies in little by little over the last 2 weeks. Lumber, hardware, tools, tarps, water jugs, food. There wasn't enough room in my old Tacoma for more than a few things at once, and I had to hike the rest up a muddy trail from where the truck could go no farther. The ground stayed soft that time of year, and every load was a fight with the slick slope. That particular day, the weather had turned rough. The sky hung low all morning, and by late afternoon, it had started to rain. Not just a drizzle, either heavy sheets of cold mountain rain that hit the leaves like gravel. I checked my phone before it lost signal completely, and the forecast warned of worse overnight. I had planned to leave and return the next morning, but I figured I could tough it out and keep watch over the site. I'd already put in the floor and 2 walls, and I didn't want the tarps blowing off or pooling water to ruin what I'd done. So I stayed. I had a small canvas tent I kept tucked under the tarps for sleeping, plus a folding camp cot and a sleeping bag rated for cold. There was enough food for a night or two and a small propane stove to heat canned soup. The rain didn't bother me much. It actually made the place feel more sealed off from the world. And for once, I didn't mind being out of touch. That night, though, turned strange in ways I hadn't expected. I remember everything in detail. The way the rain kept hammering the roof tarp like it was trying to get in. The smell of wet wood and mud mixing together. The thick fog crawling up from the lowlands and wrapping around the trees. It was almost pitch black by 6:30 p.m., and my headlamp was the only thing lighting the site. I had finished anchoring the plastic over the wall frame, driven the last nail for the day, and crawled into the tent. The wind was picking up, and I could hear tree limbs creaking high above me. Every so often, I'd hear one snap in the distance, followed by a heavy thud. That wasn't unusual for the area, but it always put a knot in my chest. I'd seen plenty of downed trees around there, torn up from storms or rot, and I'd thought more than once about how easy it'd be for one to come down right on top of me. I ate a cold can of chili from the can. I didn't even heat it up. I didn't want to run the stove inside the tent. Afterward, I rolled into the sleeping bag and zipped it up, still wearing my flannel, thermal shirt, and pants. My boots stayed outside the tent flap under a small rain shield I made out of tarp scraps. I fell asleep to the sound of the rain, but I didn't stay asleep for long. Sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't pain or fear exactly, just a sudden awareness that something wasn't right. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The rain hadn't stopped, but it sounded different now. Softer, more scattered. When I reached for my flashlight, I noticed the silence under the rain. No wind.
No creaking. No distant falling limbs.
The forest had gone still. I unzipped the flap a few inches and peeked out. The fog had thickened. My flashlight beam barely went 6 feet before getting swallowed up. I swept it back and forth across the muddy clearing I'd carved out, checking on the pile of lumber, the wall frames, the sawhorses. Nothing seemed touched. Nothing moved. Still, I stayed up. Something had pulled me from sleep, and it didn't feel like a dream. For the next hour, I sat in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, listening. I didn't hear any voices, no footsteps, no animals, just the light patter of rain and my own breathing. Around 3 o'clock, I tried sleeping again, though I left my boots inside the tent this time and kept the zipper only halfway up. When morning came, the fog lingered. I stepped out, stretched, checked everything again. Nothing was missing or broken, no tracks in the mud. I felt silly for being so wound up, but I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I chalked it up to nerves, maybe being isolated for too long, or just the weird pressure of the weather. I spent the next 2 days working harder. Got the 4th wall framed, windows rough cut, and half the roof joists secured. I stayed on site through the drizzle, the mud, and more falling limbs. Each night, the forest pressed in tighter. I'd hear things. Twigs snapping, dry leaves shifting under wet ones, soft thumps somewhere in the trees. I told myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon nosing around. I didn't cook anymore after dark. I just ate granola bars or jerky and lay still. Then came the 3rd night. It was colder. The rain had returned by late afternoon, harder than before. My tarp work held, but barely. Everything was soaked. I barely had the energy to think. I remember crawling into the tent, clothes damp, knees sore, fingers raw. I zipped up, curled into the bag, and tried to shut my mind off. But at 2:14 a.m., I remember the time from my watch. I sat bolt upright. The sound I heard wasn't rain. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the forest. It was a footstep. One single, heavy footstep, not more than 15 feet from the tent. Then nothing. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. I clicked off my headlamp, leaving myself in total darkness. My ears strained. I wanted to believe it was a branch falling or a log shifting in the mud, but it hadn't sounded like that. It had weight behind it, pressure. I sat motionless, heart pounding. Then I heard it again, another footstep. Same weight, same direction. Then another. Someone was walking, not fast, not careless. One step every 10 or 15 seconds. They were close but not coming directly to the tent. It sounded like they were moving in a wide circle, slowly, carefully, I reached down for the hatchet I kept near the sleeping bag. My hand wrapped around the cold metal handle, and I kept it on my lap. For the next 20 minutes, I didn't move. The steps would come, then stop, then start again from a slightly different direction. At one point, I swore they were right behind the half-finished wall. I gripped the hatchet tighter and braced myself, thinking they'd come straight for the tent. But they didn't. They just kept circling, watching, maybe listening. Eventually, the steps faded toward the tree line. I waited until dawn before I even unzipped the tent. When the sky turned gray and the rain eased, I stepped out, boots already on, eyes scanning every inch of the clearing. Mud was everywhere. The entire site looked like a pig pen. But in the far side of the clearing, between the firewood pile and the main frame, I saw them. 2 long footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, deep, pressed into the soft mud. Toes splayed, heel marks clear. One was slightly smeared, like whoever it was had twisted while stepping. They were human, not animal, and they were fresh. I stared at them for a long time. Then I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods, but I saw no one. I checked the ground farther out. Nothing. The rain must have erased most of it. The fog didn't help either. I felt like the trees were hiding something, like a pair of eyes could be just behind every trunk. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't even care about leaving the tools. I took only the tent, my gear, and the things I could carry in one trip. I hiked down to the truck, soaking wet, heart racing with every noise in the woods. I didn't stop once. I didn't look back. Back in Asheville, I stayed in my apartment for a week without leaving. I barely ate. I kept replaying those footsteps, that slow circle, those bare prints in the cold mud. I didn't know if it was a squatter, a hunter, some lunatic, or just someone messing with me. But whoever it was, they knew I was there. They waited until I was asleep. They didn't take anything. They didn't leave anything. They just watched. 3 weeks later, I went back with 2 friends during the day to get the rest of my gear. We didn't see anything, but one of them found a small pile of rocks behind the cabin frame, stacked in a neat little column. I hadn't done that. They were wet, clean, like they had just been set. I sold the land the next spring. Took a loss on it, didn't care. I still think about those steps, the pattern of them, the silence between each one, the bare feet in the cold mud. Whoever was out there that night wasn't just lost. They weren't some hiker or drifter. They knew I was alone. They waited for the rain to cover their sound. They circled, just slow enough for me to hear. And they left only 2 prints, just enough to let me know they'd been there. I was 34 that year, working construction jobs off and on around Colorado. I didn't have a permanent address, just a beat-up old Chevy Suburban with a mattress in the back and all my tools crammed behind the passenger seat. I wasn't married, no kids, just moved around when the money dried up or the work stopped coming. I liked it that way. I'd stay in cheap motels, rest stops, sometimes in the truck on job sites when nobody cared. I didn't mind the quiet. I'd had enough noise growing up. It was early October 2021 when a guy I knew from a roofing job told me about a cabin out past a place called Silver Pines, almost 3 hours west of Pueblo. Said it was abandoned, belonged to an old-timer who died, and the property was just sitting there. His cousin had gone up there for deer season the year before and stayed for free. No one checks on it, he said. No cell service either. You want to be alone? That's the spot. I didn't think twice. I'd been working 6 weeks straight on a framing crew in Colorado Springs, and my back felt like it was splitting down the middle. I needed a break. I figured I'd take my dog, Rye, a 6-year-old German Shepherd I'd had since she was a pup, and just stay a few days. I packed up some canned food, propane, water jugs, extra blankets, and my Remington 870 just in case I ran into a bear or something. It wasn't hunting season yet, but I wasn't planning on shooting anything. Just peace and quiet. I found the place after about 2 hours driving on gravel roads and logging trails. It didn't show up on any map. Trees were thick as hell all around, mostly pine and aspen, the leaves just starting to turn that deep yellow. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs, no tire tracks, no mailboxes, nothing. You couldn't even tell a cabin was there until you got real close. The trees hugged the clearing like a fence. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Real simple build, wood planks, one-story, tin roof, small front porch sagging a little on one side. There was a stone chimney on the left and a stack of chopped wood against the wall. Windows were dusty but unbroken. Door wasn't even locked, just had a rusty latch. I stepped inside and let Rice sniff around. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old clothes. There was one bedroom in the back, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a living room with a worn-out couch and a metal stove in the corner. Dust was on everything. Someone had left a couple pans on the counter and a can of beans with the top half open. I figured whoever had last been there had packed in a hurry. I stayed that first night without unpacking much. Built a fire in the stove and slept on the floor with Rye curled against me. It was cold enough that my breath fogged in the air. No sounds outside, no distant hum of roads or people. Just wind in the trees. I liked it. The next morning, I did a slow walk around the cabin. Rye stayed close, sniffing the ground and pawing at old tree stumps. The woods around the place were dense. Thick underbrush, fallen logs, no real path leading in or out. It made sense no one came out here unless they knew exactly where they were going. Behind the cabin, I found a collapsed shed. Looked like it had been hit by a tree at some point. Inside were old tools, rusted out gas cans, and a few animal traps. One of them still had a raccoon skeleton in it. I didn't touch anything, just left it the way it was. I spent most of that day cleaning up inside. Swept out mouse droppings, aired out the bedroom, and stacked some fresh wood inside in case weather turned. I boiled water on the stove, made some coffee, and started to relax. That's when I noticed the first thing that made me feel off. In the bedroom, the closet had no door, just a dark, open frame with a few coats still hanging inside. Nothing strange about that. But behind the coats was something that looked like a trapdoor or a square cut into the wall. I pushed the coats aside and knocked on it. It was solid, didn't swing or slide. I tried prying it with my knife and eventually got it to lift a bit. Behind it wasn't a crawl space or a cabinet. It was a narrow shaft, maybe 2 feet across, going straight down between the walls. No ladder, no steps, just dirt and roots packed tight along the edges. I dropped a pebble in and never heard it hit bottom. I didn't think much of it at first. Some cabins had old waste chutes or storage spaces that had been filled in over time. I figured maybe that's all it was. Later that night, Rye started growling around 2 a.m. Not barking, just this low, steady growl from the end of the bed. I sat up and listened. Nothing outside. Nothing moving in the cabin either. Just that growl. I reached over and grabbed the shotgun beside me. Rye kept staring toward the front door. After about 10 minutes, she calmed down and curled back up. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat on the bed with my back against the wall, waiting for something to knock or creak or move. But nothing happened. The next morning, I went outside and looked for tracks. There weren't any.
No footprints, no tire marks.
Not even fresh animal prints. It was like nothing had come near the place. Rye stayed close all day, more alert than usual. On the third day, I tried to get some rest in the afternoon and ended up falling asleep on the couch. When I woke up, Rye wasn't inside. I called for her, whistled a few times. Nothing. I grabbed my boots and went out to look. There was no sound anywhere. No birds, no wind, just dead silence. I found her prints behind the cabin, near the collapsed shed. They led into the woods. I followed them maybe 50 yards, heart pounding harder with every step. Then I saw her. She was standing still, not sniffing or walking, just stiff, staring ahead. I got closer and saw what she was looking at. Someone had built a small lean-to out of branches and bark, barely big enough for a person to crawl into. It was low to the ground and hidden in a thicket. Inside were empty cans, a blanket, a pair of ripped jeans, and a dirty red thermos. That's when my gut dropped. Someone had been living back here. Not recently, maybe a few weeks or months ago, but long enough to make it their spot. I pulled Rye back and got out of there. I didn't like the idea of some stranger hiding out that close to the cabin, even if they were gone now. That night, I blocked the front door with furniture and slept with my boots on. I kept the shotgun across my chest and Rye at my feet. Again, nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. By the 5th day, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing up early, before the sun even rose. I wanted to be back on the road by mid-morning. But when I went out to load the truck, I noticed something that made me freeze. There were boot prints around the driver's side door. Deep prints, heavy. Someone had been standing there, close, way too close, and they weren't mine. I swept around the truck, checking the tires, the engine, the windows. Nothing was missing or broken, but they'd been there, watching, maybe even listening. I drove fast, faster than I should have on those narrow dirt trails. Rye was shaking in the back seat, breathing heavy. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. When I finally got to a gas station near Westcliff, I went into the bathroom and just stared at myself in the mirror. I looked like hell, eyes bloodshot, mud on my pants, hands trembling like I'd had too much coffee. I stayed in a motel that night, locked the door, double-checked the windows. Rye didn't sleep. She just paced the room over and over. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office and told them there might be someone living out in the woods near an abandoned cabin in Silver Pines. I gave them the closest road name I could remember and told them about the lean-to and the footprints. They said they'd send someone out to check. I never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call from a guy I used to work with. He told me someone had found a shallow grave near that area. Just bones, mostly. No ID. They figured it had been there for years. Maybe a hunter that got lost. Maybe not. But I kept thinking about that trapdoor, that narrow shaft behind the coats, the lean-to, the footprints, the open can of beans, the silence. I kept thinking about the way Rye growled that night and how someone had stood right outside my truck without making a sound. I don't camp anymore. I don't go off-grid. I stay near towns now, places with locks, lights, and people nearby. I tell myself it's just for comfort, just getting older. But the truth is, I don't think I was ever alone out there, and I don't think that cabin was ever really abandoned. I hadn't been back to the cabin in nearly 7 years. Not since Lisa and I split, and now she was gone. It was late October 2022, and I was 42 at the time. Lisa and I had divorced in 2015 after 12 years of marriage. There was no shouting match or betrayal, just two people growing apart and pretending for too long that they weren't. We had bought the cabin in Dunhill, Colorado, back in 2009. It sat on a small patch of land a mile off a Forest Service road. No cell service, no internet, just a small wooden structure with a tin roof and a screened porch that looked out at the mountains. We used to go up there in the fall, sometimes in the winter too, just to get away. After the divorce, I stayed away. I figured she did too, even though technically she got it in the split. Lisa passed away that August. A stroke. 39. Her sister, Megan, called me. We hadn't spoken in years, but she said Lisa had left instructions. Something about the cabin being mine again. She'd signed a transfer of ownership months before she died and left a note in her will asking me to visit it one last time. I almost didn't go. It felt strange and heavy and a little pointless. But by mid-October, I found myself driving west through Colorado with the cabin's key in my glove box. I told myself it was just to get closure, maybe grab some of the old things we'd left behind, then lock it up for good. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The air was cold, dry. Leaves had fallen everywhere. Thick orange and yellow layers on the dirt trail that led up to the porch. The cabin looked the same as I remembered, but older. Paint peeling. A couple of boards on the deck looked warped. I parked my truck in the little clearing beside the porch, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute. It was quiet.
No birds.
No wind. Just the dull sound of my own heartbeat and the ticking of the engine cooling down. I stepped out and stretched. The ground felt soft under my boots. I looked up at the slope behind the cabin, a wooded hill that went up steep. That was where we'd hiked sometimes, followed the deer trail to a rock outcrop that looked out over the trees. Lisa used to love that hike. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood. Dust, a hint of mold. I flicked on the lights. Nothing. No power. I'd forgotten about that. The cabin had a gas-powered generator in a box out back, but I didn't feel like dealing with it yet. I opened the windows, let the afternoon air clear things out a bit. Inside, everything was just as we left it. A few dishes in the cabinet, folded wool blankets on the couch, a dead plant in the corner, a pile of books on the little table. The bed was made, too neat for how we usually left things, which made me think Lisa had come back here more recently than I thought. I built a fire in the little wood stove using some old logs stacked beside it. I made it the way she always did, small base, kindling, paper, and then a pyramid on top. Caught slowly, but it worked. Soon enough the place was warm again, and I sat down on the couch with an old camp mug full of bourbon I brought. The first night was calm. I heard a coyote howling far off and the scraping of a branch on the tin roof. I slept on the bed, still made the way she would have done it, too neatly. I didn't sleep that well, but not because of fear, just the feeling of being back in a place I didn't think I'd ever return to. The next morning, I boiled some water on the propane stove for coffee. It was cold again, colder than the day before. I threw on a heavy jacket and went outside with my mug. I walked the short path to the back where the little tool shed was. I figured I'd pull out the old folding chairs and sit out there with my drink. The shed was locked. That was weird. I never remembered locking it. Lisa didn't either back when we came together. I walked around to the generator box. It was open. The generator was there, but the fuel line had been cut. Just a clean slice straight through the rubber hose. I stood there for a minute trying to figure it out. Maybe animals? Maybe someone had vandalized it? But why would anyone hike a mile into the woods to cut a hose on a generator? Something else caught my eye behind the shed. A pile of fresh cigarette butts in the dirt. Half smoked, the filter still clean, just tossed there like someone had stood leaning against the wall and smoked a few. Lisa never smoked. I don't either. I went back to the cabin, checked the door, the windows. Nothing looked broken or forced. I took my drink and sat on the couch, staring into the fire. My thoughts were all over the place. Could someone else have been staying here? I grabbed my bag and pulled out the envelope Megan had mailed with the deed transfer and Lisa's note. It wasn't long, just a few lines. Asterisk, if you come back, don't stay long. Just take what you want and go. Some things are better left to fade.
Lisa.
Asterisk, the wording felt strange. Not spooky, just unsettled. Lisa was always thoughtful, but never cryptic. I put the note away. I decided to go for a walk, maybe just to clear my head. I took the small foot trail behind the cabin, the same one we used to hike up to the overlook. The leaves were thick underfoot, but I followed the slight groove in the hill where the path had worn down over the years. felt weird walking it alone. All the memories came back in pieces. Her laugh, her boots kicking through the brush, the way she'd stop and just stare at the trees like she was listening to something. When I got to the top, I noticed something I didn't expect. Tarp, camouflaged, strung between two trees maybe 20 feet from the rock we used to sit on. I ducked down and walked closer. Under the tarp was a campsite. A tarp on the ground too, with a foam mat, a wool blanket, and a few food wrappers, protein bar packs, beef jerky bags, water bottles. All clean and recent. Someone had been living up here. I looked around. There were no bags, no gear. Just a fire pit made from rocks and a small pile of fresh wood. The embers were cold, but only just. Maybe a day or two old. I didn't like it. I turned and headed back to the cabin faster than I'd come up. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept looking out the window, scanning the trees. I told myself it was just a squatter, someone camping up here off-grid. Colorado had a lot of that. People disappearing into the hills, most of them harmless. But that night I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something outside. A crunch, a creak. Once, something brushed against the back window. I got up and looked through the curtain, but it was too dark to see anything. I stayed in bed, holding the old hunting knife I found in one of the drawers. My heart didn't slow down until the sun came up. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Big ones. Wide boots. They went from the shed around the back of the cabin, circled twice, and disappeared into the trees. I packed my bag right away. I left the fire burning low, locked the front door, and started walking back to the truck. As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I saw something that stopped me. Pinned to the front tire of my truck was a small strip of paper, held down by a rock. I picked it up. It was torn from a notebook. The handwriting wasn't Lisa's. Asterisk, don't come back again. Asterisk, that was it. No name, no threat, but it was enough. I threw my bag into the truck, got in, and backed out fast. The trail was rough and full of fallen branches, but I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the gravel forest road and then didn't slow down until I saw pavement. I never found out who it was. The land wasn't owned by anyone nearby. The ranger station said there had been transient activity in the area, but nothing serious. I told them what I found about the camp and the note, and they said they'd check it out. I never followed up. I sold the cabin 6 months later. Didn't go back to clean it out. I hired a local company to handle it. Told them they could throw everything away. I didn't want anything else from that place. Lisa must have known. Maybe she came back toward the end, saw something or someone that scared her. Maybe she just didn't want me to see the place the way it had become. It used to be ours. A safe place. Quiet. Beautiful. Now, when I think of it, I don't see the view or the fire or the hiking trails. I see the cigarette butts behind the shed. I see the tarp strung between the trees. I see the words on that paper, scribbled in a hand I didn't recognize. And I never went back. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a short break from work and head somewhere quiet for a few days. I was 33 at the time, living in northern Idaho, doing landscaping jobs for a few clients in Sandpoint. Things were slow that year and I needed some space from everything, the phones, the noise, the city. So I borrowed a friend's old pickup and took a trip westward. Not too far, just across into Washington State, toward a wooded area near an old logging town called Delphi. I'd read about the place years earlier. It wasn't much more than a ghost of a town now, barely on the map. The plan was simple. Go off the grid for a couple of days, sleep in my own cabin for once. No one around me, no neighbors, no traffic, no responsibilities. Just trees, air, and silence. I had found a listing online a few months before. It wasn't on any official rental site, just a post buried deep in an old forum. Someone was offering a small cabin for cheap. No power, no running water, no phone signal. Just wood walls, a roof, and a decent door. It sat near the edge of what used to be the town cemetery, according to the listing. That didn't bother me. I didn't believe in all the ghost stuff, and honestly, the quieter, the better. I drove out there on a Thursday morning. It was a 4-hour drive, most of it on cracked highways and back roads that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The last half hour took me through thick forest, and eventually the pavement turned to gravel. Trees closed in tighter the farther I went. The truck bounced over potholes and branches, and I had to stop twice to clear the road by hand. When I finally got there, it was late afternoon. The sun had already dipped below the tops of the trees, and everything around the cabin was soaked in shade. The place itself wasn't big, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with a small porch on the front and a rusted metal roof. It leaned slightly to the left, like it had sunk a little on that side over the years. The windows were boarded up, but one of them had a panel missing, which let some light inside. A blackened chimney poked out from one corner. There was a padlock on the front door, just like the listing said, and the key was right where I was told to find it, under a loose stone on the porch. Right away, I noticed how quiet it was out there. I've been camping in all kinds of places, near lakes, in dense forests, high up on ridges, and I've never felt a quiet like that. Not even birds, just wind and the occasional creak from the trees when they moved. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dry leaves. There was a single cot in the corner, a folding table, and a few plastic crates with old supplies. A dented lantern, a bundle of candles, some dry canned food, and a box of nails. Nothing else.
No plumbing, no stove, no radio.
I liked it. After bringing in my pack and rolling out my sleeping bag, I decided to take a walk around before it got too dark. I brought a small flashlight and followed the narrow trail behind the cabin. The listing mentioned the graveyard was nearby, and I was curious to see it. Sure enough, after just a few minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. And there it was, the cemetery, or what was left of it. There were maybe 24 headstones, most of them leaning or cracked in half. Some were so worn you could barely make out the writing. A few had old metal fences around them, rusted and half buried in dirt. No flowers, no signs anyone had visited in years. It looked forgotten. The grass had taken over, and small trees were growing between the stones. It didn't look scary, not exactly, just empty, like nobody alive had been there in decades. I stood there for a while, just looking at the stones. I read a few of the names. Most were from the early 1900s, some even late 1800s. The last burial seemed to be from 1948. A small stone almost sunken into the dirt. A boy named Henry, just 8 years old. The place gave me a strange feeling, but I wasn't scared. It was just weird how time seemed to stop there. I left after a few more minutes and walked back to the cabin, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. The sun was gone by the time I made it back. The air had gotten colder, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I went inside, lit a candle, and ate some food I'd brought. Canned beans, crackers, and water. Then I laid on the cot and listened. Nothing. No wind, no animals. Not even the usual popping of the forest floor cooling off. Just stillness. It wasn't until I lay down completely, wrapped in my sleeping bag, that I started noticing small sounds. Faint ones. It was hard to tell where they were coming from. Not loud enough to really notice. More like shifts in pressure, or the feeling that something had moved just out of earshot. I figured it was the trees. I kept the candle burning, even though I didn't plan to. Something about that silence made me want light. I ended up falling asleep with it still going, my eyes staring up at the wooden ceiling. I woke up suddenly around 2:30 a.m. I checked my watch right away. The candle had gone out, and the cabin was pitch black. I didn't know what woke me, but something felt off. I stayed still, trying to hear anything. At first, I thought it was just a dream or the cold waking me up. But then I heard it again. A faint sound, like something brushing against wood. It wasn't near me. It came from behind the cabin, toward the back wall. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, but the battery was low and the light was weak. I scanned the inside of the cabin. Everything looked the same. Nothing had moved, but the sound came again, closer this time, like footsteps on dry leaves, slow and dragging. I held my breath and listened. Silence. Then something tapped the back wall. Once, then again, light like fingers. I stood up, careful not to make the cot creak too much, and went to the front door. I slowly opened it and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold and still. The moon was barely showing through the trees, and everything looked like it had a silver coat on it. I walked around the side of the cabin, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the back, I didn't see anything, just trees and leaves. No tracks, no animals. I walked a bit farther, shining the light at the tree trunks, the ground, even the graveyard in the distance. Nothing, but something had touched that wall. I know it. I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved the crate in front of it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the boards over the window, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came, it was a slow crawl of pale light through the cracks. I didn't wait around. I packed my things and decided I was going to leave early. I'd had enough of peace and quiet. I went outside to pee and looked around one last time before loading my bag into the truck. That's when I saw something that made my chest tighten. On the back wall of the cabin, right where I heard the tapping, were 4 long scratches in the wood. Not claw marks, scratches, like from fingers. Long, uneven grooves, maybe 2 feet long each. They hadn't been there before. I walked over and touched them. Fresh. The wood was still pale inside the grooves, not weathered like the rest. I checked the ground again. Still no footprints. Nothing. I should have left right then, but something made me turn toward the graveyard one last time. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. I took the trail back and stood at the edge of the clearing. But something was different. The little stone, the one that said Henry 1948, was gone. I swear to God, I stood right there and looked at the spot where it used to be. The grass was smooth. No hole, no stone, nothing. Like it had never been there. I checked again, walking through the graves, reading every stone. It wasn't just moved. It was gone. Erased. I didn't waste another second. I ran back to the truck, threw my stuff in, and got out of there. I didn't stop until I reached the next town over and got a room in a motel. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? I couldn't prove anything. There were no photos, no tracks, no sign anyone had been out there. But I know what I saw, and for weeks after that, I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound made me sit up in bed. I started locking my doors more, even though I'd never done that before. I even stopped camping for a while, which was something I used to love. It's been years now, but I still remember that cabin, that graveyard, that missing stone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night, if I hadn't checked the back wall, if I hadn't noticed the scratches. But I'm glad I didn't stay. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I was 27 that fall. My mom had been a cop for over 2 decades. She'd worked her way up from patrol in the rougher parts of Fort Smith, Arkansas, to a detective position with the state. Everyone respected her. She was serious, always calm, never really cracked jokes or showed a lot of emotion. But she was smart, tough, and she never lost control. That's what people said about her. We weren't that close growing up. She was usually on the job. I was mostly raised by my grandma, but she passed away when I was 19. After that, Mom and I started talking more, but there was still some kind of wall between us. In the fall of 2022, she bought this old cabin out in the Ouachita Mountains. She said she wanted a quiet place to retire. It was a one-story wood place with a small porch, backed up right into a thick wall of pine. There was no signal out there, no internet. You had to drive a mile down a gravel road just to get cell service. I visited once that summer. It was peaceful, maybe too quiet. The land behind it went on forever, hills and dense woods and deer trails. She'd installed some security cameras around the cabin and put up solar lights on the path to the tool shed. But other than that, she liked the isolation. I didn't go back until late October. She had taken a few days off work, and she asked if I wanted to come spend a few nights with her out there. I figured maybe it was her way of trying to reconnect. I said yeah, packed a duffel bag, and drove the 3 hours out there with my dog, Boone. He's a black lab mix, 7 years old, friendly, but sharp. Always listens, always alerts me to things before I notice them. I got there just before sunset. I remember the sky was orange, and the trees were loud with wind. The driveway was just dirt, and when I pulled up, the tires crunched against dead pine needles. My mom was standing on the porch in her jacket, arms crossed, waiting. I parked, got out. Boone jumped down behind me. She nodded, patted him on the head once, and then led us inside. The inside of the cabin was simple.
No TV, no radio.
Just a fireplace, some old furniture, and her gear lined up neatly by the door. Her service belt, holster, a couple knives, and one shotgun on a rack. She still had her habits from the force. Everything was organized, locked down. She'd even installed 2 deadbolts and a steel bar on the inside of the door. That first night, nothing happened. We sat by the fire while Boone dozed at our feet. She cooked canned stew and we ate in silence. She looked tired, more than usual. Something in her eyes was different, tense, distracted, but I didn't ask questions. I didn't know how to. Around 11, she stood up and said she was heading to bed. I stayed up for a while, just staring into the fire and petting Boone. He kept lifting his head to sniff toward the window. I figured it was deer moving around outside. The woods were alive out there. Every crack of a branch echoed like it was 5 feet away. I finally went to bed on the couch. Boone curled up near my feet. The fire had gone low. The cabin was pitch dark except for the dim solar lights flickering outside. I woke up around 3:40 a.m. to Boone growling low in his throat. He was standing at the window, tail stiff, ears forward. His nose was touching the glass. I sat up, wiped my eyes, and went to him. Couldn't see anything out there. I whispered his name, rubbed behind his ears, tried to calm him. His body was tense, like a spring about to snap. Then he let out a sharp bark and jumped back from the window. I heard something move outside, slow footsteps, crunching leaves. Not an animal. Too slow, too heavy. I stayed still. The footsteps moved past the side of the cabin, toward the back. Boone was shaking, staring at the wall. I went to the fire, grabbed the iron poker, and listened. The back door had a deadbolt, same as the front, but no steel bar. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, Boone laid down again, still alert but quiet. I sat next to him and waited until the sun started coming up. When Mom came out of her room around 6, I told her what happened. She just nodded once, walked outside with her jacket on, and checked the trail behind the cabin. Came back 5 minutes later, face blank, and said it was probably nothing. Could have been a stray hunter or some drifter. I asked why the cameras didn't catch anything. She said they'd been acting up, battery drain, poor footage at night. Said she'd been meaning to replace them. That whole day, she didn't relax. She carried her sidearm on her hip the whole time, even while making breakfast. She kept glancing toward the tree line, like she was waiting for someone to walk out of it. I tried to joke about it, but she didn't even smirk, just kept scanning the woods. That evening, the wind picked up. It got cold fast. Around 8 p.m., we sat near the fire again, Boone asleep beside me. Mom finally said something that stuck with me. She told me people think retirement is relaxing, but sometimes all it does is give you too much time to think. That's all she said, but I knew what she meant. She'd seen things in her job, stuff you can't unsee. I think being alone out here gave her too much space for those memories to echo. That night, around the same time, 3:30 a.m., Boone jumped up again. This time, he ran to the back door. I was already awake. I hadn't really slept. I grabbed the poker again and stood with him. He was growling low, staring at the door like it would burst open. Then we both heard it. Slow footsteps on the porch. A pause. Then a soft tap on the door. Not a knock. Tap. Bare fingers on wood. I froze. Boone was snarling now, low and sharp. I looked toward my mom's room. Her door was open, and I could see she wasn't in bed. I moved slow, crept to the hallway. She wasn't in the house. The tap came again. I backed away, heart racing, and went to the front window. Just shadows, trees, a flicker of a solar light. Then, at the edge of the yard, maybe 15 feet from the porch, I saw something. A man, not moving, just standing there. He wasn't looking at the house. He was facing sideways, looking toward the woods. His jacket looked torn, sleeves too short, head tilted like he was listening to something behind him. I watched him for over a minute. He didn't move once, just stood there. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the cabin. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding in my throat. I turned to grab Boone's collar, and when I looked again, the man was gone. I grabbed the shotgun from the rack. Loaded. My mom kept everything ready. I stood there shaking, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to fire through a door unless I had to. Then I heard footsteps again, this time coming from behind the cabin. The back door creaked. I spun toward it, raised the shotgun. Boone was losing it now, barking loud, teeth bared. Then my mom's voice came from outside, calm, low, just one sentence. "It's me." I opened the door. She stepped inside, her gun drawn, jacket soaked in sweat. She looked at me and said nothing, just nodded once. She walked over to the window, looked out for a long time, then pulled the steel bar off the front door and slid it across the back instead. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, she told me we were heading into town. I asked her what was going on, and after a long silence, she said she thought someone might be watching the cabin. She didn't know why, said it had started a few weeks ago. Lights moving in the trees at night, things out of place in the shed, tire tracks down near the creek bed. She'd filed a report, but without real evidence, it just sat in the system. She said she'd seen the man before, always from a distance, always at night, but he never approached, just stood and watched. Never the same clothes, never the same place. We packed our stuff. She locked up the cabin and we drove into town. I didn't argue. I wasn't going to leave her out there alone. Later that day, while we were eating in a diner off the main road, she made a call to a guy she knew from the department, asked him to keep an eye on the place, said she might sell it. I could tell she didn't want to, but something had changed. She never told me exactly what she saw that night in the woods. She never admitted she was afraid. But after that trip, she sold the cabin within a month. Cheap, no questions asked. Some out-of-state buyer picked it up. Cash deal. I never saw that man again. But sometimes, when I wake up around 3:30 a.m., I think about him standing out there, just past the trees, waiting for something, or someone. And I remember the look in my mom's eyes when she walked back into that cabin. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was back in the summer of 2019. I was burned out from work, tired of my apartment in Sacramento, and sick of constantly hearing traffic, sirens, and neighbors through paper-thin walls. I needed to get out. Not for a few hours, not a weekend. I wanted a full reset. A real disconnect. No phone. No internet.
No noise.
I had some saved up vacation time and a little extra money from a side project that wrapped up early. A buddy of mine who used to work in timber told me about a place up in Central Oregon, near the Old Ochoco National Forest. His uncle had owned some property out there way off the grid, and there was an old logging cabin still standing. It hadn't been used in years, but the land was legally his, and he said if I wanted real peace and quiet, that was the place to go. I didn't ask a lot of questions. That's kind of how I was back then. I just wanted solitude. I packed up my truck with enough supplies for 3 weeks. Canned food, rice, jerky, pasta, cooking oil, bottled water, tools, sleeping bag, a small solar charger for a flashlight, a folding saw, some rope, a first aid kit, a hunting knife, and a couple paperbacks. No phone.
No GPS.
I printed maps ahead of time and highlighted the rough route. It would take me about 9 hours, including the rough part off-road. The drive north through Oregon was beautiful. Rolling green hills, wide rivers, patches of pine. It was all so different from the scorched concrete and smog I'd grown used to. Once I passed Prineville and hit the last stretch of dirt trail, it was nothing but thick forest. Trees blocked out most of the sky, and there were long stretches of silence. No birds, no wind, just the tires crunching gravel. The road ended at a faded gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. I had the old key, and after fiddling with it for a few minutes, I got it open. The rest of the path had to be walked. About 1.5 miles in, through thick trees and patches of overgrown weeds, I saw it. The cabin was about the size of a 2-car garage, made of old weather-worn pine logs, with a pitched metal roof rusted at the edges. A tin chimney stuck out of the side and a rain barrel sat beneath a wooden awning. There were no power lines.
No satellite discis.
Just the trees, the cabin, and the moss-covered ground. It was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first day cleaning. Dust everywhere. Cobwebs in every corner. The door was swollen from moisture and stuck, and the windows barely opened. Inside, there was one main room with a small cast iron stove, a single cot, and some broken shelving.
No bathroom. No plumbing.
The outhouse was about 50 feet out back. The floorboards creaked like crazy, but they were solid. I swept, cleared out old mouse droppings, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I lit a lantern and read for a bit, then just sat and listened to the sounds of the woods. First, it was perfect. I'd wake up early, boil water on the little stove, cook oatmeal or rice, then take long hikes through the trees. I marked a few paths with red string so I wouldn't get lost. The air smelled sharp and fresh. I'd come back sweaty, tired, and sit on the steps of the cabin drinking water straight from the bottles I brought. Sometimes I'd fish in the little creek downhill. I didn't catch much, but it was enough to keep my mind off everything. By the end of the first week, I started to relax. I didn't think about work. I didn't check the time. My whole routine became sunrise, movement, food, sunset, and sleep. But there was something off. Started small, little things. I'd hang my jacket on a nail inside the door, and the next morning, it'd be on the back of the chair instead. Or I'd stack my firewood a certain way and come back from a hike to see the top pieces turn sideways. I assumed I was just tired or not paying attention. Maybe a squirrel or raccoon came in through the gap in the window. That sort of thing. Then I found the boot print. It was behind the cabin, right near the firewood stack. A full-sized, clear imprint in the mud. Too wide for my foot. Too long. Definitely not mine. I stood there staring at it for a while, then looked around at the trees. There was nothing. No sound. No movement. I even called out, which felt dumb, but I didn't know what else to do. No answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in the cot with the lantern burning and the knife in my hand. I kept thinking, maybe a hunter? Maybe someone passing through? But the location was so remote, it made no sense. There were no other cabins nearby, no other paths. Whoever had been there either followed me in or was already around before I came. The next day, I walked a wide circle around the area, checking the trees, the dirt, anything. I found a few more prints leading toward the creek. Deep ones. The person was heavy, maybe wearing gear, but they didn't look fresh. I kept trying to tell myself it was old, maybe just from months or years before. I convinced myself hard enough that I let it go, at least enough to try and keep enjoying the peace. But then, about 10 days in, I came back from a hike and found the cabin door open. Wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I was absolutely sure. I always jammed it shut. It didn't even open easily. But there it was, swinging slightly in the wind. I stopped about 20 feet back and just stood there. I didn't move. I listened. I waited a full 2 minutes. Then I walked wide around the front, picked up a branch, and tossed it through the doorway. Nothing. I waited again. Then I stepped in. Everything looked the same. Cot, shelf, stove, my sleeping bag, my backpack. Nothing seemed missing. But when I looked down, I noticed something. My boots had been moved. I always lined them up near the cot, heels against the leg. But they were out in the middle of the floor. One was sideways. The other looked like it had been stepped in. I checked the backpack. My food, my tools, still there. I looked over everything 3 or 4 times. But I didn't sleep that night. I left the lantern burning and stayed up with my back against the wall, staring at the door, clutching the knife. Every small sound, wind in the trees, a twig snapping, made my heart thump like a drum. The next morning, I found another print behind the cabin, this time closer to the outhouse. The same boots, same size, deep like they'd been there recently. I wanted to leave. Everything in me told me to go. But my truck was parked nearly 2 miles back through dense woods. I'd have to hike back, unlock the gate, drive the dirt trail without getting stuck, and make it to town without knowing if someone was nearby watching me. And besides, I was stubborn. I told myself it was paranoia. I didn't want to overreact. But I did start locking the cabin from the inside. I set up noise traps with cans and string on the door. I made a pile of rocks at the front step so I could hear anyone approach. I carved a mark on a tree outside to see if anything got moved during the night. Then, 2 nights later, I heard something. It was just past midnight. I was half asleep, laying on the cot with my knife on my chest. The fire had burned out. The air was cold. Then I heard it, a slow crunching sound. Footsteps in dry leaves. Close, right outside. I didn't move. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, heart pounding, eyes locked on the door. Then, faintly, I heard it again. Not walking this time, just shifting, like someone was crouched down, breathing. I stayed frozen for probably 10 minutes. Nothing happened. Then I heard it, a soft scrape on the wall, like a finger or a stick dragging across the outer logs. It circled once, slowly, then silence again. I waited until sunrise to move. When it got light enough to see, I opened the door and stepped out slowly, knife in hand. There were boot prints again, fresh, leading from the tree line to the wall, then back. Same size, same pattern. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin. I hiked out that morning to my truck. I didn't pack anything. I just left. When I got to the truck, I found something that made my blood go cold. A piece of cloth, a gray bandana, was tied to the driver's side mirror. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. It hadn't been there before. I looked around again. Nothing in the woods. No sound.
No birds.
Just stillness. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to California. Later, when I told my buddy what happened, he got quiet, said the land had belonged to his uncle's logging crew, and they used the cabin for equipment during the 70s and 80s. But he also mentioned something I didn't know before. There was a man, a logger, who went missing out there in 1986. No body ever found. Just vanished one night after drinking at camp. People said he might have wandered into the woods and got lost, or maybe just left. But the crew always joked that he'd stayed behind to watch the place. I don't believe in ghosts, and this wasn't anything like that. This was real, flesh and blood. A man, maybe a squatter, maybe someone who never left that forest. But I've never gone back. I don't camp anymore. I live in a one-bedroom now with locked windows and neighbors on both sides. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear something outside. A scrape, a shift, a breath. But I remind myself, I'm not in that cabin anymore. At least I hope I'm not. It was late October 2022 when I packed up my things and drove north into the forests of central Idaho. I had just turned 33, and my job as a freelance mechanical draftsman had reached a point where every little sound, every email, and even the humming of my ceiling fan felt like it was carving into my skull. I was tired. I couldn't think clearly anymore. I had been grinding through blueprints for weeks without a break. I hadn't slept well in days. Even the caffeine wasn't helping. I needed silence, true, thick, undisturbed silence. So I took a week off, shut everything down, and brought only the bare essentials into the mountains. My old dog, Murphy, a calm and loyal 8-year-old golden retriever, rode in the back of the truck, head sticking out the window and ears flapping in the cold wind. He had this way of making the world feel softer, even when it wasn't. I rented a cabin deep in a remote part of Valley County, somewhere about 2 hours past Cascade. The roads thinned out quickly once I got off the highway. Trees closed in. It was the kind of country where no cell towers reached and road signs disappeared. The directions the owner gave me were handwritten and vague. Things like, after the third wooden bridge, take the dirt track on the right with the split pine tree. That kind of thing. It was a one-room structure, just wood and nails, built in the 70s probably and not maintained since the 90s. A small deck out front faced the forest, and the back led down to a creek that ran behind the property. There was no electricity. A propane tank powered a little heater and a stove. A water tank above the shower slowly dripped cold water. A cot sat against the wall, and a big wood stove in the corner warmed the entire space if you kept it fed. It was perfect. I arrived around 4 p.m. on a cloudy Monday. The owner had left the key in a plastic bag under a pile of rocks near the steps. I unlocked the cabin, hauled in my gear, unpacked 2 days' worth of food, and checked the place top to bottom. There was no insulation. The floorboards creaked. There were mouse droppings behind the cupboards. Still, it felt safe enough. There were no neighbors in sight, and even the dirt road that led in was hard to spot once you were on foot. That first night, Murphy curled up on his blanket near the wood stove while I sat on the deck with a can of chili and listened to the woods come alive. Cold air drifted between the trees. It smelled like pine sap and wet soil. I heard owls and the far-off cries of something I couldn't place. Maybe an elk. I couldn't see much beyond the first few trees, but it didn't matter. I wasn't there to look. I just needed to be away from everything. Around 11, I went inside, shut the door, and dropped into the cot. Murphy stretched out beside me, breathing heavy and slow. But I didn't sleep. Not really. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, presses on your ears. That night, it felt like that. Even with Murphy there, something about the quiet made me restless. I heard the old cabin groaning under its own weight. The wood stove popped and cracked every few minutes. Once, I swear I heard something outside walking past the wall, slow and deliberate. Murphy's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. I figured it was just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I barely slept 2 hours. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and took Murphy out for a walk. We followed the creek south for about a half-mile. The trees got thicker down that way, and the ground was soft with moss and old leaves. Murphy stayed close, sniffing at every stump and pile of rocks. That's when I noticed something strange. Nothing serious at first, just things out of place. A rusted shovel leaning against a tree, a cracked metal bucket in a bush, stuff that didn't belong that far off the trail. I figured maybe someone had lived out here at some point. There were no cabins nearby on the maps, but maybe someone had squatted here years ago. I didn't think much of it. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the afternoon splitting kindling and stacking wood. I brought in the last of the water jugs from the truck. I wrote a little in my notebook. No phone, no laptop, just me and the dog and the forest. That night, around 2 a.m., Murphy woke me up, not with barking, but with this low growl just deep in his chest. He stood up stiff, nose toward the front door, ears pulled back. His fur was slightly raised along his spine. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The fire had burned low. Only a faint red glow lit the room. I stayed still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, faintly, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, I heard something crunch outside. Leaves or gravel. Something moving out there. Murphy didn't bark. He just stared at the door and growled quietly. I got up and moved slowly toward the small window beside the door. I cupped my hands to the glass and leaned close. The moonlight gave me just enough to see outlines through the trees. I waited, a few seconds, then a minute. Nothing moved. Eventually Murphy stopped growling and went back to his blanket. But I stayed up the rest of the night. I didn't hear the sound again, but I felt it. The feeling of not being alone. Next morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin. Big ones. They weren't mine. Too wide, too long. I checked the treads against my own boots just to be sure. These ones were deeper too. Whoever it was must have been heavier than me, or carrying something. I walked the perimeter for about an hour, looking for more. I didn't find much, just a second set near the edge of the creek where the trees opened slightly. There were drag marks there too, like someone had pulled a bag or a stick through the dirt. That's when I started to feel watched. You know that heavy feeling on the back of your neck when you just know something is out of place? That constant. It didn't leave me the rest of the day. I kept turning around while chopping wood. I kept checking the trees. Murphy did too. His head would snap to the side at random moments. He'd stare into nothing for long stretches of time. I loaded my rifle that night, not because I wanted to use it, just because I needed to know I could. Sleep was even worse. I kept the fire going, and Murphy didn't leave my side once. I lay there, fully clothed, rifle within reach. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The same slow movement outside, this time around the back of the cabin. Murphy lifted his head and looked toward the back wall, ears high. I got up, carefully, and moved to the back window. There wasn't much to see, but I opened the window just a crack, and then I heard it clear as day. Breathing, not an animal. Human, slow, calm, almost measured. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes. My own breath barely moved. Murphy was completely still beside me. Then it stopped, and just like that, I heard footsteps moving away, slow and steady, into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I checked around back. More boot prints. They circled the entire cabin. Same size, same depth. Whoever it was had walked around the place completely in the night and then disappeared. I packed most of my gear right then and there. I wasn't going to wait for whatever came next. I loaded the truck, called Murphy, and drove, but the road out was blocked. About 40 yards from the turnoff, someone had dragged a fallen tree across the path. Not one that had broken naturally, it had been cut with a saw. Clean, fresh edges, sap still wet. I stopped the truck, heart pounding. It hadn't been there before. Someone wanted to trap me in. I reversed back to the cabin, grabbed the axe, and started cutting. It took me over an hour to break it up and clear enough to pass. I was sweating in the cold. My hands were shaking, but I got through. I didn't stop driving until I reached Cascade. I found the first gas station with a lit sign and pulled in. I sat there with Murphy for 20 minutes just breathing, hands gripping the wheel, heart still racing. I never went back. I didn't call the cabin owner. I didn't file a report. What would I say? That someone watched me through the woods for 3 nights and walked around my cabin breathing against the walls? No, but I'll say this. I've never been that scared in my life. Not in a movie, not in a dream, not anywhere. And I still don't know who it was, or what they wanted. But I know this much. They knew I was there. They watched me, and they were waiting for something. And if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be telling you this now. I started working as a seasonal park ranger in the spring of 2019, just a few months after I turned 28. I had worked a few smaller jobs before that, trail maintenance, volunteer wildfire monitoring, but nothing steady. When the opportunity came to get assigned to a small national park in eastern Oregon, I took it. They were short-staffed and needed someone to handle solo shifts deep in the woods during the early months before peak summer. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and I liked being alone, so it seemed like a perfect fit. They gave me an old government pickup, a satellite radio, and a key to a small wooden ranger cabin way out near the southern boundary of the park. The park wasn't huge, maybe 40 miles across, but there were thick patches of forest that felt endless, and only a few dirt service roads cut through them. My job was mostly to check trail signs, make sure campers weren't breaking rules, and monitor any signs of illegal hunting or fires. Easy stuff, the kind of things you don't really need a team for. The cabin they stationed me at was called West Ridge Shelter on the park maps, but the other rangers just called it the box because it was a plain rectangle of timber with one front door and 2 small windows. It sat near the base of a shallow ridge covered in pine and fir. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. Just a small wood stove, a propane lantern, a creaky bed, and a steel cabinet that locked shut. Inside the cabinet was a basic first aid kit, a few maps, an emergency locator beacon, and a binder full of handwritten notes from past rangers. There wasn't much in the way of comfort, but I didn't come out there looking for comfort. I liked the quiet, and for the first couple of weeks, things were fine. I'd wake up at dawn, heat up coffee on a small camp stove, grab my field notebook, and spend the day walking trails or driving up and down the rough forest roads. There weren't many visitors yet that early in the season, just the occasional hunter or backcountry hiker. Most of the time, I didn't see anyone all day. One thing that stuck out early on was how often I'd spot signs of people that I didn't actually see. I'd come across ashes from a fire that looked maybe a day old, or footprints on overgrown side trails that hadn't been cleared yet. Nothing illegal, really, just strange, because I kept track of who entered the park through the official gates, and some of those areas shouldn't have seen anyone. I chalked it up to poachers or old-timers from nearby towns sneaking in. The first real weird thing happened near the end of April. I had hiked out to an old fire tower about 5 miles east of the cabin, mostly just to stretch my legs and check for wind damage. The trail up was a steep climb, and I didn't bring much gear besides my radio and a canteen. The tower itself was long abandoned and no longer safe to climb, but the base still had an old storage shed with some broken equipment and a rotted cot. I noticed that someone had tied a piece of red nylon cord across the path about halfway up the hill. It wasn't just lying there. It was strung tight between two trees at about ankle height, hidden in the underbrush. I almost tripped over it. The ends were tied with knots that looked practiced, not like something a kid would do. It wasn't Park Service issue, and there were no work orders out there. Someone had set it up, and they didn't want people going further. I ducked under it, kept going up, and made a note to return with bolt cutters the next day to remove it. That night, back at the cabin, I didn't sleep well. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear exactly, more like I couldn't settle down. I kept thinking about that nylon cord and wondering why it was there. I kept imagining someone watching from the trees as I stepped over it. There weren't any windows that faced directly into the woods, and that somehow made it worse. I found myself lighting the lantern even though I usually tried to conserve fuel. The next day, I hiked back out there, cut the cord down, and pocketed it. Nothing else seemed disturbed. No fresh prints, no trash. I chalked it up as a leftover from a past hiker or maybe some kids screwing around, though I still didn't like how hidden it was. For the next 2 weeks, things stayed quiet again. I did my rounds, logged everything, kept notes in the cabin logbook. But then, in early May, something started happening at night. I'd wake up and the cabin door would be slightly open. Not wide, just a few inches. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't latched it right. The wood was old and the frame was warped, so sometimes it took a solid push to seal it. But it happened again, and I knew I was locking it. I started wedging a piece of firewood against it from the inside. That seemed to work. But then I noticed small things were out of place in the morning. My boots weren't where I left them. A water bottle was missing, then reappeared 2 days later under the cot. Once I found my field notebook outside on the steps, soaking wet from the dew. The pages were still legible, but I knew I hadn't brought it outside. At this point, I contacted the ranger office back in town over the satellite radio. I asked if anyone else had been sent out to my area. They said no. I asked if they'd had reports of squatters or campers going off trail. Nothing. They didn't take it seriously. Just said to keep an eye out and maybe check the trail cameras. So I did. There were 2 old motion-activated trail cams mounted along the southern border trail, about a mile from the cabin. I hiked out, collected the SD cards, and checked them on my personal laptop that night. Most of the footage was of deer, birds, wind-blown branches. But one clip stood out. It was dated 5 nights earlier, around 2:13 a.m. In the footage, I could see the trail faintly lit by moonlight, and then a figure walked past, alone. No flashlight, no pack. They were moving slow, crouched low, like they were trying not to be seen. They passed through the frame in less than 10 seconds. I froze the image, tried to zoom. It didn't help much, but it looked like a man, maybe middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, bald or shaved head. I don't know why, but my skin crawled watching it. There were no reports of any missing people in the area. No trespassers had been caught at any gates. This person had come in and left without anyone seeing them, probably not for the first time. I saved the clip and sent it over the satellite link. Took over an hour to upload. The response I got back was basically a shrug. They said they'd alert law enforcement, but unless I saw the guy again, there wasn't much they could do. The park didn't have the budget for patrols. I didn't sleep that night. A few days later, I was out checking a back trail about 2 miles from the cabin. It was late afternoon, maybe 5 p.m. I was on foot, no vehicle. I remember stopping to rest on a stump near a dried creek bed when I heard movement in the trees behind me. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I stood up, turned, and waited. Nothing came into view, but the sound kept going, then stopped. I called out just in case it was a hiker. Nothing. I waited for 10 minutes, then slowly backed up the trail, hand on the bear spray in my vest. Nothing followed me, but when I looked down at the trail, I saw boot prints that weren't mine. Fresh, edges still sharp, heading the same way I had just come. I picked up my pace, got back to the cabin just before dusk, and didn't leave again that night. The final straw came 2 nights later. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft tapping sound. I stayed still, kept going tap, tap, pause, tap. It was coming from the side wall of the cabin, near the back window. I sat up, reached for the flashlight, and didn't turn it on. I listened. It stopped. I waited another few minutes. Then I heard something even worse. The sound of breathing, just outside the window. Slow, shallow. I slid off the bed, crept to the cabinet, and pulled out the emergency flare gun we kept for distress signals. I didn't aim it out the window. I just held it. The breathing stopped. I stayed like that, crouched in the dark until first light. When morning came, I went outside and found footprints all around the cabin. Clear ones, barefoot, and not child-sized either. Adult-sized, heel to toe, some pressed deep into the mud. Whoever it was had circled the cabin multiple times. I took photos, radioed the ranger office, told them I was leaving. They tried to argue, said someone would drive out in 2 days to check on things. I said I wasn't waiting. I packed my gear, locked the cabin, and drove back to town. I never found out who it was. The rangers who replaced me said they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I quit the job a month later, moved back to the city, got an office job. I still think about that night sometimes. Still picture that trail camera footage. That man walking through the trees like he belonged there more than I did. Some places aren't meant for people to live in. Not for long. Not alone. I don't usually talk about this trip. Not because I'm scared of it now. I'm not. But because every time I go over it in my head, I realize how close I was to something I don't even fully understand. Not in a paranormal way. There were no ghosts or monsters or anything like that. But something about the whole thing felt wrong. Like I had walked into the middle of something I was never supposed to see. And I'll never forget how it all ended. Not for as long as I live. This happened back in the fall of 2016. I was 33 years old, living in southern Idaho at the time, working in a machine shop. Hunting had always been my way of getting away from everything. I didn't do it for trophies or to show off. I liked the quiet, the stillness, the long walks through open land, the silence of the woods that made me feel like I wasn't even part of the world anymore. My Uncle Gerald had passed away the year before, and he left behind a small hunting cabin up in the mountains near Stanley. It wasn't in great shape, just a one-room building with a fireplace, an old mattress on a wooden frame, a water pump out back, and a rusted-out propane heater that barely worked. But it was in a good spot, isolated near a ridgeline surrounded by thick pine woods. There were mule deer all over that area, and even some elk if you knew where to look. I decided to take a week off in mid-October, drive up there with my old Remington, and spend a few days hunting alone. I packed dry food, water jugs, a flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, a hatchet, and a first aid kit. I also had a handheld radio in case I needed to get a signal off the ridgeline. There was no cell reception up there at all. The drive up was slow and cold. It had snowed lightly a couple days before, and the dirt road leading into the forest was half frozen. I had to stop twice and chain up my tires. It was already dark by the time I reached the cabin. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and all the trees around me looked like frozen shadows in the headlights. I parked a few feet from the door, shut off the engine, and just sat for a minute listening to how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, no crickets, just dead silence. I unpacked my gear, brought it inside, and lit a couple of lanterns. The place was freezing, and the propane heater only worked if you sat right next to it. I threw on my jacket, loaded up the fireplace with some dry wood I had stored in the back, and got a fire going. Once the cabin warmed up a little, I lay down on the old mattress, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up around 6. It was still dark outside, but I could see a bit of pale light behind the tree line. I got dressed, ate a cold protein bar, grabbed my rifle and pack, and headed out. I hiked northeast toward a small ridge I remembered from a trip years ago. It took me about an hour to get there, walking slow through brush and snow patches, keeping quiet. I saw some fresh deer tracks near the edge of a clearing, but they were headed deeper into the woods. I followed them for a while, moving slow, stepping carefully. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I kept stopping, listening, waiting to hear something move. Usually you'd hear squirrels, woodpeckers, maybe the wind pushing through the branches. But there was nothing, just the crunch of my boots in the frost. Around noon, I found what looked like a makeshift campsite. Not a real one, just a ring of stones where someone had made a fire. A few burned logs were still inside the circle. Nearby was a pile of bones, deer bones picked clean. I saw part of a skull, some ribs, a femur. They weren't fresh, but they weren't that old either. Maybe a couple weeks. Some of them still had bits of dried sinew stuck to them. But what bothered me wasn't the bones, it was the tarp. Someone had tied a green plastic tarp between two trees, like a crude shelter, but it had been slashed through in a dozen places, torn almost in half. I looked around, trying to see if there were boot prints or gear left behind. Nothing, just that cut-up tarp, the bones, and the fire ring. It didn't sit right with me. A hunter might make a camp like that, sure, but why would they leave it like this? Why would they slash the tarp? I stood still for a while, staring into the trees, listening hard. Then I heard a noise, not close, but not far. Something cracking through the brush, maybe 100 yards out. I froze and waited. It was gone. I scanned the woods with my scope, moving slowly. Nothing. I left the area and circled back toward the cabin. I didn't want to be out there any longer. My chest felt tight the whole walk back, like I was being watched. I kept checking my 6, turning around every couple of minutes, thinking I'd see someone following. But the woods were empty. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door, stoked the fire again, and sat down. I kept thinking about that torn-up tarp. Maybe it had been animals. Maybe someone was trying to scare other hunters off. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up every hour, staring out the window at the black trees, listening to the wind creak through the walls. The next morning, I stayed close to the cabin. I tracked a few deer near the edge of a frozen creek and got a shot on a young buck around noon. I dragged the body back, dressed it, and hung the meat in a canvas bag out behind the cabin. That felt good, normal, like the trip had a purpose again. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. Just past midnight, I was lying in my bag, eyes closed, when I heard snow crunching. Footsteps. They weren't fast, just slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide, trying to stay as still as possible. The fire was out. The lantern was off. I was in total darkness. Then the steps stopped right outside the front door. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, holding my breath, gripping the knife under my pillow. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Eventually, the sound faded. The steps moved away. The snow stopped crunching. In the morning, I went outside and saw the prints. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human. Whoever it was had walked through snow in bare feet. The tracks circled the cabin twice, then disappeared into the trees. I wanted to leave right then, but I convinced myself it was just a drifter. Some crazy guy living off the land. Maybe high, maybe didn't even know I was there. I took the meat down, packed my gear, and loaded the truck. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine clicked once, then went dead. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it looked fine. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. The spark plugs were gone. Just gone. Someone had pulled them out. I was stuck. No radio signal. No phone. No other cabins for miles. I locked the truck, went back inside, and blocked the door with a chair. I stayed up all night, shotgun across my lap, staring at the door, waiting. The footsteps came back around 3 a.m., same slow crunching. Same circle around the cabin. I didn't move, didn't sleep, just waited for morning. When light came, I went out to the tree line with my scope, scanned every inch of the woods. Nothing. I had to walk out. I packed light, just my rifle, some water, and a flare. I left the deer meat behind. I marked the route on a paper map, then hiked west toward the ranger station I remembered from a trip years ago. It was 17 miles. The hike was quiet. Still, my legs were weak. I felt like I hadn't slept in days. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped to rest. That's when I found the second tarp. Same setup, same fire ring, but this one had something under it, a backpack. I checked it. Inside were a knife, some torn clothes, a small journal. I flipped through it. Most of the pages were water damaged, but I could still read a few. He keeps coming at night, barefoot, staring in the windows. Took my boots, took my ammo. I think he wants me to run. Can't leave. Truck's dead. He cut the wires. That's when I dropped the journal and started moving again. I didn't stop until I saw the ranger tower just before sunset. I collapsed at the door and hit the emergency radio. A day later, they towed my truck out. Never found the spark plugs. Never found the barefoot prints. They said maybe I imagined it. Or maybe it was some mountain guy long off the grid. But I know what I saw. And I know someone was watching that cabin. Not just mine. Others too. Maybe he waits until people are alone. Watches them through the trees. Tests them. Makes them stay longer. Slower. Tired. Cuts them off from help. I never found out who he was. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it that winter, burned the journal, moved south, and I never hunt alone anymore. I don't usually tell this story to anyone, but lately I've been thinking about it more and more. Maybe getting it out of my head will help. It happened back in the fall of 2021 in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. I was 34 at the time, single, working remotely, and trying to finish a small personal side project, building a tool for data tracking, just something I thought could turn into a startup eventually. I had been working on it from my apartment in Denver for months, but I kept getting distracted by emails, city noise, neighbors, all that stuff. One night, I was scrolling through rental sites and found this small cabin way up in the mountains, not far from Pagosa Springs. It wasn't fancy. No TV, no internet, just a generator and basic solar setup. But it had heat, a small kitchen, and most importantly, no one around for miles. I booked it for 3 weeks. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful in photos, the kind that makes you think of snow and silence. A spot to clear your mind and work. I drove up on a Monday morning. Took about 6 hours to get there. The roads got narrower as I went. The last 30 minutes were on a single-lane gravel road full of turns and blind spots. Trees thick on both sides, cliffs occasionally to the right. No phone signal for the last hour. I kept glancing at the GPS before I lost signal, trying to remember the route in case something went wrong. When I got there, the place looked just like the pictures. A small A-frame cabin, old wood, metal chimney pipe poking out, with a wraparound porch and a shed about 50 feet away. Forest all around. I didn't see a single person from the last turn off the highway to the cabin itself. Not one car, not one building. That was the point, right? The lockbox had the key just like the owner said. I opened the cabin up, unloaded my food and gear, got the small gas generator going, and set up my workstation on the little kitchen table near a window. I felt good. I really did. I even thought to myself that this could be one of the best decisions I'd made all year. The first couple of days were great. I worked from 7 in the morning to around 6 or 7 at night. Took breaks for quick hikes on nearby trails or walked to the shed to split some firewood. I didn't hear anything but wind and trees. The nights were silent. I didn't even use the generator at night, too loud. I had candles and a few lanterns I'd brought. I listened to old music on my phone, read books, slept deep. On the fourth day, Thursday, I noticed something strange. I had just come back from a short hike after lunch and saw a footprint outside the shed. Just one, right near the corner of the door. It was in dry dirt, hard to tell how fresh it was, but it was clear. A hiking boot, size 10 or 11 maybe, bigger than mine. I wear a 9. At first, I thought it was probably my own. I walked around it a few times, but I hadn't been wearing boots that day. I had hiking shoes with a different tread. I checked my bag, checked the shed, checked around the cabin, didn't see anything missing. I chalked it up to maybe it had been there since before I arrived. Maybe the owner left it. Still, it stayed in my mind. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, just something off in the air. The wind sounded harsher. I kept hearing creaks from the porch like old wood shifting, but every time I looked through the window with a flashlight, there was nothing. I told myself it was just nature doing its thing. Animals, maybe. On Friday morning, I went outside early. I found more footprints. This time there were 2 side by side, near the path I had used to walk back from the trail the day before. Again, same kind of boot tread, too big to be mine. Now it was harder to explain away. I hadn't seen or heard a vehicle. No one should be out here unless they were hunting or lost. There weren't even tire tracks on the dirt path leading to the cabin. If someone walked here, they had to come through thick woods. I checked the shed again. Still locked. Nothing missing that I could tell. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't see anything damaged or disturbed, but the woods felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder. That afternoon, I left a stick against the door of the shed. Just leaned it lightly, not in an obvious way. It was a test, I guess. I didn't know what I was expecting. That night, I slept with the lantern on low. The next morning, Saturday, the stick was gone. Not fallen, gone. I searched around. It wasn't on the ground nearby. That didn't sit right with me. I felt watched. I even called out once, just into the woods like an idiot, but there was no response.
No hecho.
Just quiet trees. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that there was probably some hunter or camper who got too close and left, maybe just curious. But that didn't explain why the person wouldn't knock or say anything, or why there were never more than 1 or 2 prints. It didn't make sense. I thought about leaving, but the project was going well and I was stubborn. I had 1 week left. I made a mistake on Sunday night. I left my laptop bag out on the porch. It had nothing important, just a backup power bank, some cords, headphones. I forgot to bring it in before bed. Around 3 a.m., I heard something on the porch, a scrape and a thump. I froze in bed, listening. I didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. The sound didn't come back. In the morning, the bag was gone. Gone. I searched everywhere. Around the cabin, under the porch, behind the trees. Nothing. I went out toward the tree line and shouted. Just short, angry sounds. Half words. Still nothing. I stood there a long time, feeling stupid and alone. It was around then I decided I would leave early. The next day, I told myself. I packed up most of my stuff, ran the generator just long enough to back up my files, and turned it off. I kept a fire going in the small wood stove to keep warm through the night. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I thought I saw something move past the window. A shadow, just a flash. I grabbed the small axe I'd used for firewood and held it all night. I didn't even blink much. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't relax either. By dawn, I was ready to go. I grabbed the last of my bags, locked the cabin, and got in my truck. The road out felt longer. I kept checking the mirror. Halfway down the gravel road, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the path. Fresh, thin trunk, green leaves. I could see the torn roots. It didn't fall by accident. It had been cut, dragged, and dropped. No chainsaw marks, cut by hand. I got out and stared at it. It wasn't big enough to stop my truck completely, but it blocked the front. I'd have to move it or go around, but going around meant getting close to the tree line, and I didn't like the idea of getting out of my truck for long. I did it anyway. Took me 10 minutes to drag it partially aside. While I was doing it, I kept turning around, looking at the trees. Every few seconds, I was shaking. I don't remember breathing. I got back in, floored it, and didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I finally got back to Denver that night, I felt like I had a fever. My skin was burning. I sat in the shower for nearly an hour, just letting hot water hit me. That night, I slept with the lights on. I didn't unpack for 3 days. I sent a message to the cabin owner. Said something vague like, "Thanks for the stay, but I think someone might have been on the property during my visit. Just wanted to let you know." They never replied, not even once. A few months later, I checked the listing again. It was gone. I looked up the address and searched around on forums, just in case someone had posted about something similar. Nothing. It's been 4 years. I haven't gone camping alone since. Sometimes I dream about that place, but in the dream, the windows are all broken, and I can hear someone walking in circles around the cabin, dragging something heavy. I always wake up sweating, and the worst part, I still don't know what they wanted. They didn't steal anything valuable, didn't hurt me, just watched, got closer each day, and waited. That's what I remember most, the waiting. It was the spring of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had just turned 35 that March, and I had been working nonstop for nearly a decade. I was living in Birmingham at the time, working as a structural engineer for a firm that took more than it gave back. It had been a long winter, the kind that never seemed to end, and something about the way the days were just blending together started to eat away at me. I felt detached, like I wasn't really part of my own life anymore. I don't remember where I first saw the listing. It might have been on one of those smaller travel websites, some local Welsh site with cabins for rent out in the hills. The photos were simple. A plain wooden cabin set back into a small clearing, surrounded by nothing but trees and hills, some parts of it carpeted with moss. One picture showed a narrow dirt road leading through thick forest. Another showed a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bed tucked under a window that looked out toward a steep hill. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had what I wanted: space, quiet, and no people. The price was cheap too, a week for less than £300. I booked it without thinking twice. I told a couple friends I was taking a break in the countryside, then packed my car with food, a couple blankets, and a few books. I left the city early on a Monday morning, just after sunrise. The drive was long and uneventful. I took the A44 into Mid-Wales and then followed smaller and smaller roads into the hills. There were fewer houses the deeper I went. I drove past sheep in fields, old stone walls, rusted gates. I had printed directions since the area had no signal, and by the time I left the last paved road, I didn't see another car or person. The dirt track was narrow, muddy in places, and surrounded by dense forest. I passed a half-broken wooden gate, then followed the path uphill for maybe a mile. I started to worry I had taken a wrong turn, but eventually the trees opened up and I saw the cabin, just like in the photos. It sat in a small clearing, maybe 50 feet from the tree line, with a low stone wall running behind it, moss-covered and half-collapsed in places. There were no other houses nearby, just open hills behind and woods all around. There was an old tin roof, a little chimney, and a narrow porch with a bench. The door was unlocked, just like the email had said it would be. The inside was cold but clean. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, a bed, a couple chairs, and a table. There was a solar-powered light, but no other electricity.
No Wi-Fi.
No signal. It was perfect. The first day passed slowly. I built a fire in the stove, made tea, unpacked a few things. I didn't do much else. I sat outside in the afternoon sun and watched clouds drift over the hills. There wasn't a single noise from cars or people, just the wind through the trees and a few crows somewhere far off. The silence was thick. I didn't realize how much noise I lived around every day until I wasn't in it anymore. That night, I slept well. The bed was firmer than I was used to, but I had brought my own blanket. I heard the wind a few times and something tapping on the glass once or twice. Probably a tree branch or a bird, but nothing that kept me awake. I remember looking out the window once in the dark. The moon was barely visible, clouds drifting across it. The clearing outside looked strange in the low light, like it was hiding something. But I didn't feel scared. Not yet. It was the second night when something shifted. That morning, I had hiked a few miles through the hills. There was no real path, just sheep trails and grassy slopes. The ground was damp, soft under my boots. I saw a couple of ruined farmhouses and a rusted tractor left to rot in a ditch. Everything out there felt untouched, like no one had been in those hills for years. I came back in the late afternoon, tired and a little sore. I lit the stove, made soup, and read for an hour or two before getting into bed. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had died down, and the room was cold. My blanket was tangled, and I remember shivering a little as I sat up. I stayed still for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a sound outside, slow, deliberate footsteps on gravel. I froze. The cabin didn't have much in the way of security, just a wooden door with a latch and two small windows. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. There was no reason for anyone to be up here. No cars.
No neighbors.
No signs of other cabins. I stayed sitting in bed, heart pounding. The steps stopped. Then, after a few seconds, I heard them again. Closer. Crunch. Crunch. They weren't fast. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or a dog. But the pattern of the steps was too steady, too slow. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved toward the window. I stayed back in the shadows, just enough to peek out without being seen. At first, I didn't see anything. The clearing was empty. The trees swayed a little in the wind, and the grass moved in slow ripples. Then I spotted her, a woman. She was standing near the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a birch tree, just standing there, not moving. She wore a long coat, dark and heavy, and something over her head that looked like a scarf. I couldn't make out her face. She was too far away and the shadows were deep, but I could tell she was facing the cabin, watching it, watching me. I stayed still for what felt like minutes, eyes fixed on her. She didn't move, didn't turn, didn't speak, just stood there. Eventually, I moved back from the window, heart hammering. I stood in the middle of the room and listened. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't brought a weapon. The cabin didn't have locks strong enough to stop someone determined. I kept listening for footsteps but didn't hear any more. After a while, I dared to look again. She was gone. The clearing was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see footprints, just the same damp grass and patches of gravel. But the ground was soft enough that someone could have walked through without leaving much behind. I walked to the edge of the clearing where she had stood and looked into the trees. Nothing. I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was a hiker who had taken a wrong turn. But the nearest town was almost an hour away. There were no trails, no signs, no landmarks. Even if she had gotten lost, why would she be watching the cabin in the middle of the night? That day, I didn't leave. I stayed close, kept the fire going, tried to read but couldn't focus. Every sound outside made me jump. I looked out the window dozens of times. Nothing. But as evening came on, a part of me started to dread the darkness. That night, I stayed dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed. I left the fire burning longer. I listened, and sure enough, just after midnight, I heard it again. The same slow footsteps. Crunch, crunch. This time I moved to the window more quickly, already expecting her. And there she was, closer than before, just standing in the open now, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, directly facing it. Still, not moving. I couldn't see her face. She wore the same dark coat, same scarf. Couldn't tell her age. She stood like a statue. No phone, no light,
No bag.
just stillness. I felt real fear then, the kind that grips your chest and doesn't let go. This wasn't someone who had wandered here by accident. She wasn't looking for help. She wasn't calling out. She didn't knock. She just stood there, watching. I sat down in the corner out of view and stayed that way until morning. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. The first light, I looked out. She was gone. Again. I considered leaving then. I even packed my bag. But I had driven 5 hours out, and something about leaving in a panic felt like admitting defeat. Like I was letting fear get the better of me. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone knew I was staying here and thought it was funny. I had posted a photo of the cabin to a private story on Instagram. Maybe a friend had figured out where I was. The idea didn't quite make sense, but it was better than the alternative. Still, I didn't stay the full week. On the 4th morning, I packed up for good. I loaded the car just after sunrise. I checked every corner of the clearing one last time. I didn't see her. The forest was quiet. The hills still slept under a low mist. I drove out fast, bumping down the dirt path, glancing into the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't relax until I hit the main road. When I got back to Birmingham, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want questions. I deleted the photo I had posted. I tried to forget about it. But a few days later, I got a parcel in the post. No return address. Inside was a photo, just one. It was of the cabin, taken at night. The windows were lit up from the inside, the fire casting a yellow glow. And outside, just visible in the edge of the light, was a woman in a dark coat, standing still, watching. I never went back, and I never will. It was late September of 2013 when I left the city to stay at my uncle's old farm cabin in rural Arkansas. I was 26 back then, burnt out from work, tired of the constant noise, and just needed a break. My Uncle Mark had passed away 2 years earlier. He didn't have any kids, so the property had been left to my mother. She wasn't interested in keeping it, and I'd heard her talk about selling it more than once. Before she did, I wanted to visit it. Not for any sentimental reason. I just needed space, and it seemed like the perfect place for it. Far away from the city, surrounded by woods and open fields. I packed up my car with enough food and clothes for a couple of weeks and made the 6-hour drive out there. I remember how quiet the roads got after the last gas station. It was just me, the trees, and stretches of empty two-lane highway. I didn't see another car for almost 40 minutes at one point. The farm was about 30 minutes off the main road, down a long dirt path that cut through the woods. The path was barely wide enough for my car, and branches scraped the sides of the vehicle as I drove down it. When I finally got there, I parked in front of the cabin, stepped out, and just stood still for a moment. There was no sound but the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. No cell signal either. The cabin itself was old but still solid. It had a big covered porch, dark green siding that was chipped in places, and a metal roof that had turned dull from years of rain. There was a single light bulb hanging above the porch door, but I didn't expect the electricity to work, and I was right. The power had been cut off after my uncle died. I brought a battery lantern and some flashlights, so I wasn't too worried. The inside of the cabin smelled stale, like old wood and dust. There were two small rooms, a main area with a wood stove, a worn couch and a table with two chairs, and a back room with a bed and a small dresser. The bathroom was outside, an old wooden outhouse about 20 yards from the back door. Behind the cabin, there were some half-rotten sheds and the overgrown remains of what used to be a garden. An old windmill stood in the field beyond that, missing a few blades, creaking gently as it turned in the breeze. Past that, it was just rolling fields and the start of thick pine forest. The first couple of days were peaceful. I chopped firewood, read books, and sat on the porch for hours at a time. I walked the fields during the day, trying to get a feel for the land. At night, I lit the lantern and read by the dim light until I fell asleep. No internet, no noise, just quiet. On the fourth day, I decided to clean up the area around the sheds. They were falling apart, two of them leaning so far I figured they'd collapse with the next storm. But the third one, the one farthest from the cabin, seemed sturdier. The door was jammed shut, so I had to yank hard to get it open. When I finally did, the hinges screamed, and a gust of old air spilled out. It smelled like oil, dry hay, and something else, something faint but sharp and sour. Inside, it was mostly empty. Just some rusted tools, a broken wheelbarrow, and a pile of old feed sacks in the corner. I moved a few things around just to look. Nothing interesting. I figured I'd just clear out the junk and maybe use the space to store firewood. But as I was walking out, something caught my eye. A patch of dirt behind the shed that looked different from the rest. It was sunken slightly, and the grass over it was dead, while the rest of the yard was full of weeds. First, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just dry soil, but I couldn't stop looking at it. It was like a perfect rectangle, maybe 4 feet long by 2 feet wide. Later that night, as I sat inside reading, I kept thinking about that patch. It bothered me. I couldn't explain why, but it just felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. Around midnight, I stepped outside to clear my head. The air was cold, the stars bright, and the only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere far off in the trees. I shined my flashlight toward the back shed. The light beam caught the side of the building, then the ground behind it. The patch looked even darker at night. I didn't walk over to it. I just stood there, staring at it from the porch before finally going back inside. The next morning, I brought out a shovel and walked back to the shed. I told myself I was just curious. Maybe it was an old burn pit or a filled-in well. The ground was dry and packed tight, and it took me a while to dig down. A few inches in, I hit what looked like old plastic tarp. It was gray and stiff and cracked when I tried to pull it up. Beneath it, I saw wood, dark, rotted planks. It was a box, a wooden box. My stomach dropped when I saw that. I cleared more dirt away and tried to lift the lid. It didn't budge. I had to dig around the edges to get my fingers under it, and when I finally got it open, the smell hit me so hard I nearly fell backward. It was this thick, rotting stench that made my eyes water. Inside were bones, small ones, not animal bones, not shaped like any animal I'd ever seen. There were other things too, shreds of clothing, what looked like pieces of plastic, maybe from a bag, and a rusted metal chain with a padlock attached to it. I didn't touch anything. I just stared. I didn't know what to do. I reburied it. I don't know why. I just panicked. I put the tarp and the dirt back over it, packed everything down, and walked back to the cabin. My hands were shaking. I washed them 3 times in cold water from the jug I kept on the counter. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking about what was in that box, who it was, why it was buried there, why it was locked shut. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to go driving through the woods in the dark. The idea of breaking down on that road at night made my stomach turn. The next morning, I packed up my things. I threw everything in the car, locked the cabin, and started the engine. I got about halfway down the dirt path before I stopped. Something was standing in the field off to my right. I thought it was a deer at first, but it wasn't. It was a person, a man, just standing there in the tall grass, not moving. He was too far away for me to see clearly, but I knew he was looking at me. He didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood there, watching. I pressed the gas and drove the rest of the way out without stopping. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I got back to the highway and didn't slow down until I was back in town. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call the police. I know how that sounds, but it was rural land and I'd already buried it again. I told myself it was probably old, maybe something from years ago, something that had already been forgotten. Maybe my uncle had found it too and just never told anyone. A week later, I saw a news article online about a missing person case from the late 90s in the same county. A teenage girl had gone missing near the woods, not far from that area. Her case had never been solved. I sent an anonymous email to the county sheriff's department. I gave them the location of the cabin and told them to check behind the last shed. I never heard anything back, and I didn't follow up. I didn't want to know. My mother sold the property a month later. I didn't go back. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear stories on the news about missing people or unsolved crimes. I think about that box and the man standing in the field and the lock on that chain. I don't know what happened out there. I don't want to know. I went looking for peace and quiet, and I found something that didn't belong to me. Something I was never meant to see, and I've never gone back to the woods since.